This is a fictional narrative inspired by nature. Everything you see exists only in imagination, not in the real world. Now, let's enter the story.
They took the little girl away in a rush of voices and footsteps, and for a moment the world seemed to freeze. People believed the lion would turn back, that instinct would pull him toward the wild and erase what had been. Instead, he stood there, silent, watching until she disappeared from sight. Something changed in his eyes. Without a sound, he turned and began to walk, not toward home, but toward the unknown path she had taken. I remember feeling my chest tighten then, realizing this was not an ending. It was the beginning of a journey no one expected. Long before anyone believed a lion could walk miles for a little girl, there was a quiet beginning that few people noticed. The girl lived near the edge of the reserve, in a place where the wild did not feel distant or dangerous, but familiar. Animals passed through the land often, and she had grown up learning when to stay still, when to step back, and when to simply observe. The lion was young then, separated from his mother during a chaotic migration. He wandered closer to human territory, not out of curiosity but confusion. Smaller than the lions people imagined, thinner, cautious, he moved with hesitation rather than power. Their first meeting was accidental. The girl saw him near the trees, frozen in place, unsure whether to run or hide. He saw her and stopped as well. Neither moved. That moment did not feel dramatic. It was fragile. The air between them carried more uncertainty than fear. Slowly, the girl sat down, lowering herself to the ground, as she had been taught. She did not reach out. She did not call for help. She simply stayed. After a long while, the lion turned away and disappeared into the brush. But he came back the next day, then again the next. Over time, distance became familiarity. The lion learned her scent, her stillness, the sound of her quiet voice when she spoke to no one in particular. She learned his moods by the way his tail moved, by the pauses in his steps. There were days he stayed close, and days he kept his distance. Nothing was forced. Trust grew the way roots do, unseen but steady. The people nearby noticed eventually. Some warned her family. Others watched in disbelief. They expected the lion to change, to act like the creature they feared, but he never did. Around her, his movements softened. His eyes followed her not as prey, but as presence. I remember feeling unsettled when I first understood this part of the story because it challenged everything we think we know about instinct and boundaries. As weeks turned into months, their connection deepened in ways that words cannot easily describe. The lion began to wait for her. If she did not appear, he circled back, restless. When she laughed, he lifted his head. When she was quiet, he lay down nearby, alert but calm. This was not training. There were no commands, no rewards, only recognition. What struck me most was how ordinary it became to them. To outsiders, it was unbelievable. To the girl and the lion, it was simply life as it unfolded. She did not see him as a symbol or a miracle. He did not see her as something fragile. They met each other where they were, without expectation. But moments like these never exist in isolation. The world has a way of intervening when something feels too delicate to last. Authorities began to notice. Conversations happened behind closed doors. Worries grew louder. People spoke about safety, about rules, about what should and should not be allowed. The girl did not understand all of it, but she felt the shift. The lion did too. He became more alert, more watchful, as if sensing a change in the air he could not name. I often wonder if this was the moment when the bond between them quietly prepared for loss, even before it arrived. At the end of that chapter of their lives, nothing had been broken yet. But something had been set in motion. A connection strong enough to survive separation had already taken root, waiting for the moment it would be tested. The days that followed settled into a quiet rhythm, one that felt almost untouched by the outside world. The girl would arrive in the mornings, sometimes with dust on her shoes, sometimes with leaves tangled in her hair. The lion was often already there, resting in the shade, lifting his head the moment he sensed her presence. They did not need constant closeness. Some days she sat nearby and read aloud, her voice steady and calm. Other days she wandered a short distance away, collecting stones or watching birds, while the lion followed her movements with his eyes. There was an unspoken understanding between them, a shared awareness that did not demand attention but offered reassurance. What made these moments remarkable was not their intensity, but their simplicity. There were no grand gestures, no dramatic scenes, just time passing gently, stitched together by familiarity. The lion grew stronger, his frame filling out, his steps more confident. Yet around her, that strength softened into patience. The girl noticed everything. She learned when he preferred to be alone and when he wanted company. She learned the difference between his alert stillness and his relaxed rest. In return, the lion learned her moods. He sensed when she was tired, when she was excited, when she needed silence more than words. Watching them together, it was easy to forget how fragile this peace truly was. I found myself holding on to these moments, knowing deep down that stillness like this never lasts forever. People who passed by often paused at a distance, unsure of what they were seeing. Some felt awe, others felt fear. But for the girl, none of that mattered. This was not a spectacle, it was simply a part of her day. And for the lion, she was not an exception to his nature, she was part of his world. As weeks turned into months, the bond between them became woven into their routines. If she arrived late, he waited. If she left early, he followed her with his eyes until she was gone. There were afternoons when the sun dipped low and painted everything gold, and they remained still, side by side, as if time itself had decided to pause with them. These were the days that would later feel unreal, like memories softened by distance. Days when nothing was wrong, and no one imagined how quickly that could change. Subtle signs appeared, though few noticed them at first. Conversations among adults grew more frequent and more hushed. The girl sometimes arrived with a heavier expression, quieter than usual. The lion seemed to sense it, staying closer, more attentive, as if trying to anchor her to the present moment. I remember thinking how unfair it felt that something so gentle could be threatened simply because it existed. There was one afternoon when she lingered longer than usual, her hand resting on the ground between them, her gaze distant. The lion stayed still, closer than he normally did, his breathing slow and steady. Nothing happened that day, no alarms, no sudden changes. Yet, when she finally stood and walked away, both of them paused, as if neither was ready to let go of the moment. Looking back, it feels like that was the last truly peaceful day they shared, even though neither of them knew it then. Sometimes, the quietest chapters are the ones that prepare us most for what comes next. The day everything changed did not begin with fear. It began like any other, quiet and ordinary, which somehow made what followed feel even heavier. The girl arrived later than usual. Her steps were slower, her voice softer when she spoke. The lion noticed immediately, lifting his head and watching her more closely than before. There were unfamiliar voices nearby that morning, the kind that did not belong to the land. They moved with purpose, speaking in low tones, glancing toward the trees. The girl stood still when she realized they were there. She did not call out. She did not run. She only looked back once, toward the lion. He rose to his feet. The separation happened quickly. Hands guided her away while words filled the air, words she did not fully understand. The lion stepped forward, then stopped, sensing something he could not fight. He did not roar. He did not charge. He only stood there, watching as the distance between them widened. I felt a sharp ache in my chest, imagining that moment, the helplessness of understanding what is happening but having no way to stop it. The girl turned her head just once. Their eyes met. In that instant, there was no panic, only recognition. Then she was gone, swallowed by movement and noise, leaving behind a silence that felt unnatural. For a long time, the lion did not move. People assumed he would retreat. That instinct would take over and pull him back into the wild where nothing hurt like this. But he stayed. He paced the edge of the clearing, stopping often, listening. He returned to the spot where she used to sit, lowering his head as if the ground itself might explain what had happened. Hours passed. Then night came. The lion remained. He did not sleep. He watched the path where she had disappeared, his body tense, alert to every sound. When morning arrived and she did not return, something shifted. Confusion gave way to restlessness. He walked farther than usual, scanning the land, following traces that only he could sense. It was painful to witness how the absence settled around him, filling every familiar space she once occupied. Days followed with no sign of her. The people nearby spoke of the situation as resolved. They believed the bond had been broken by distance, by logic, by necessity. To them, this was the end of a strange chapter. To the lion, it was not an ending at all. He waited. Then he searched. Each day, he ventured a little farther from the place they had shared. Not randomly, but deliberately, following a direction that seemed guided by something deeper than memory. Hunger did not stop him. Fatigue did not turn him back. He returned each night, as if checking whether she might somehow reappear. I kept thinking about how many times we underestimate the depth of attachment simply because it does not look like our own. There was one evening when the lion stood at the edge of the land, staring into a distance he had never crossed before. He paused there for a long time, the wind moving through his mane, carrying scents from places unknown. Then, without hesitation, he stepped forward. That was the moment everything changed. The waiting was over. The searching had a direction now. Whatever connection tied him to the girl had not weakened with separation. It had sharpened. Distance did not erase it. It defined it. As he walked away from the place they once shared, there was no certainty waiting for him ahead, only the pull of something unfinished. At that point, I realized this was no longer a story about loss. It was becoming a story about determination and the quiet power of not letting go. After the girl was gone, the land slowly returned to its routines. People passed by. Animals moved through familiar paths. Life, to everyone else, continued. But for the lion, time seemed to fold inward, stretching each day into something heavier than the one before. He returned again and again to the places she used to sit, the shade beneath the trees, the worn patch of earth where her footsteps lingered faintly. He lowered his head often, breathing in as if the ground itself might still carry her presence. When nothing answered him, he stayed anyway. There was no urgency in his waiting at first. It felt patient, deliberate, as if he believed this absence was temporary. Each morning, he lifted his head at distant sounds. Each evening, he paced the edge of the clearing before settling down, facing the direction she had last gone. Watching this part of the story, I found myself wondering how many forms waiting can take and how often we fail to recognize it when it does not look like desperation. Days passed. Then weeks. The patience began to change. The lion started walking farther from the familiar ground. tracing the edges of his territory, then pushing beyond them. He followed faint trails, paused at unfamiliar scents, and stood still for long stretches, listening. When nothing came of it, he returned, not defeated, but unresolved. People noticed his movements and assumed they meant restlessness, nothing more. They believed time would dull whatever connection had existed. After all, that is how it usually works. But this was not forgetfulness. This was persistence. One afternoon, the lion waited from sunrise until the heat pressed heavily against the land. He did not lie down. He did not seek shade. He stood, facing outward, his body tense with attention. I remember feeling a quiet ache at that image, because it looked so much like hope refusing to sit down. Hunger eventually pulled him away, but even then, his movements were careful, efficient. He ate, then returned, as if nourishment was only a brief necessity, not a priority. The nights were the hardest. Without the girl's presence, the darkness felt deeper. Sounds carried farther. The lion's sleep was light, fractured. Each rustle stirred him. Each distant echo drew his attention. Still, morning always found him back at the same place, watching. There came a point when the waiting itself became a decision. The lion no longer stayed only to see if she would return. He stayed to remember her, to hold space for something that mattered, even if no one else believed it did. And then, gradually, the direction of his waiting shifted outward. He began choosing a path. It was subtle at first. One day, he walked a little farther than before, in a single direction. The next day, farther still. Each time, he paused at the same distant ridge, standing there as if measuring the land ahead of him. I found myself holding my breath during these moments, sensing that something inside him was aligning, preparing. The waiting was no longer about standing still. It was about gathering resolve, about listening to an inner pull that grew stronger with each unanswered day. By the time the lion finally turned his back on the place they once shared, his waiting had transformed into intention. He was not leaving because he had given up. He was leaving because staying no longer made sense. Sometimes, the deepest kind of waiting is the one that teaches us when it is time to move. The morning the lion finally left, there was no drama to mark the moment, no sudden sound, no visible hesitation. He stood at the edge of the land for a long time, facing the open stretch ahead of him as if committing the shape of the horizon to memory. Then he took a single step forward, and another, and did not look back. This was not the kind of movement driven by hunger or fear. It carried a different weight. Each step seemed measured, intentional, guided by something quieter but far more powerful. The lion moved as if following a thread only he could sense, one that stretched beyond familiar ground. As he crossed into territory he had never explored, the land changed. Scents layered over one another, unfamiliar and distracting. Sounds echoed differently. The paths he once knew gave way to uncertainty. Still, he continued. His pace was steady, conserving energy, adjusting to the distance ahead. I remember thinking how remarkable it was that he did not rush, as though he understood this journey would require endurance, not speed. Days passed as he walked. Sometimes he paused, standing still for long moments, lifting his head, testing the air. Other times he altered his course slightly, guided by instinct refined through patience rather than urgency. When exhaustion set in, he rested briefly, then rose again. There were moments when the journey seemed to ask too much of him. The heat pressed down. The ground grew rough. Food became harder to find. Yet none of these obstacles turned him back. Each challenge was met with quiet adaptation, not resistance. The farther he traveled, the more evident it became that this was no longer a search fueled by confusion. It was a pursuit shaped by memory. The lion was not wandering. He was following something that had already taken root within him. At one point, he stopped near a shallow rise, overlooking a wide expanse he had never seen before. He stood there as the light shifted, shadows stretching across the land. I found myself wondering what it takes for a creature to trust an inner pull so completely, without proof, without reassurance. That pause marked a turning point. From there on, the lion's movements grew more direct. His path no longer curved back toward the familiar. It pressed forward, cutting across distance with growing certainty. What struck me most was the absence of doubt. He did not question the journey. He did not hesitate at the thought of what lay ahead. Whatever bond had formed between him and the girl had become something stronger than instinct. It had become a promise, one he carried without words. The nights were long, and the land was unforgiving. Still, each morning found him rising, scanning the distance, and moving again. His body bore the strain, but his direction never wavered. By the time the lion reached the far edge of what he once considered his world, the journey had reshaped him, not weakened him, but focused him. The waiting was gone now. In its place stood purpose. Sometimes I think the most powerful promises are the ones made silently, when no one is watching and nothing is guaranteed. As he continued forward, leaving behind everything familiar, one thing became clear. This was no longer a question of whether he would find her. It was a question of how far he was willing to go. And the answer, it seemed, was farther than anyone expected. The farther the lion traveled, the quieter the world seemed to become. Familiar sounds faded, replaced by stretches of land that felt vast and indifferent. The paths beneath his paws changed texture, from soft earth to dry, uneven ground that tested his balance with every step. This part of the journey had no witnesses. No one followed him. No one guided him. There were no signs to confirm he was moving in the right direction. Only distance, unfolding slowly, one measured step at a time. The lion walked mostly at dawn and dusk, resting when the heat grew heavy, conserving strength for what still lay ahead. There were moments when exhaustion pressed against him like a physical weight. His muscles ached, his breath grew slower. Sometimes he lay still longer than intended, eyes half closed, listening to the unfamiliar rhythms of the land. And yet, each time he rose again, his body seemed to remember why it was moving. I remember thinking how loneliness can feel louder than pain, and how remarkable it is that he did not turn back even once. Hunger became a constant companion. The prey here did not move the way he expected. Scents misled him. Tracks vanished abruptly. When he did eat, it was brief and practical, just enough to continue. This was not a journey of comfort, it was one of necessity. The nights tested him most. Without known territory to shelter him, he slept lightly, alert to every sound. The sky felt wider here, the stars sharper, as if the world had stripped itself down to essentials. In the darkness, the absence of the girl seemed to press closer, filling the quiet with memory. Still, he moved forward. At times, he stopped abruptly, lifting his head, turning slowly, as if listening to something beyond sound. His direction would shift slightly after these pauses, subtle changes that suggested an internal map only he could read. I found myself holding on to these moments, wondering what signals guide us when logic falls away. The land offered challenges without explanation. A sudden storm soaked the ground, turning it slick and heavy. The lion waited it out beneath sparse cover, his body tense, conserving warmth. When the rain passed, he stood, shook himself, and continued as if delay had never crossed his mind. There was a stretch where the terrain rose sharply, forcing him to climb with careful effort. Each step demanded focus. Each slip threatened to undo hours of progress. Yet, when he reached the top and paused, the view before him felt different, wider, more open. I felt a quiet lift in my chest then, sensing that something ahead was drawing closer, even if it could not yet be seen. Fatigue etched itself into his movements. His pace slowed, but his direction remained true. This was no sprint toward reunion, it was endurance shaped by belief. What struck me most during this chapter was how little drama the journey carried. No sudden victories, no clear signs of success, just persistence repeated endlessly in silence. There were moments when he appeared to falter, standing still for long minutes, his body lowered, his breathing heavy. Watching that, I found myself wondering how many times we stop just short of what we seek because the silence convinces us nothing is waiting. But the lion never turned back. As the days blurred together, something within him seemed to sharpen. His movements grew more deliberate again, his pauses more purposeful. The land no longer felt entirely foreign. It felt closer, as though it was beginning to answer him. By the end of this stretch of the journey, the lion was no longer the same creature who had left familiar ground. The waiting had burned away hesitation. The distance had stripped him down to resolve. Sometimes it is the longest and quietest journeys that reveal what we are truly willing to hold on to. The first sign came so quietly that it would have been easy to miss. The lion slowed his pace, lifting his head as a faint scent crossed the air, fragile and almost gone. He stood there for a long moment, unmoving, as if the land itself had whispered something familiar. It was not certainty. Not yet. Just a flicker of recognition. He moved forward carefully, retracing a few steps, then advancing again, testing the air from different angles. The world around him felt subtly altered, as though something ahead was no longer entirely unknown. His body responded before his mind could form, meaning muscles tightening with renewed focus. I felt my breath catch at this point, realizing how powerful even the smallest hint of hope can be when it arrives after so much silence. The lion followed the faint trail until it vanished. He paused, unsettled but not discouraged. Instead of turning back, he waited, letting the air shift, letting time pass. When another trace appeared, even weaker than the first, he adjusted his direction and continued. This pattern repeated itself over the next days. Brief moments of recognition, followed by stretches of uncertainty. The signs were inconsistent, fragile, easily lost, but each one changed the way he moved. His steps grew more confident, his pauses more intentional, as if he were no longer searching blindly but listening for confirmation. The land itself seemed to echo familiarity. Certain sounds carried differently now. The rustle of distant movement no longer felt random. Even the light, filtering through unfamiliar terrain, seemed to mirror places he had once known. These were not clear signals. They were impressions, felt more than understood. At one point, the lion reached a narrow path that curved between rocky outcrops. He stopped there, his body tense, his head tilted slightly. For a long moment, he did not move. Then, slowly, he stepped forward, choosing the path without hesitation. I found myself wondering how many times we ignore the quiet directions life offers simply because they do not arrive loudly enough. As the days passed, the signs grew more frequent. Scents overlapped in ways that felt deliberate rather than accidental. Tracks appeared, faint but purposeful. The lion began to rest less, driven by a sense of closeness that sharpened his resolve. Still, doubt lingered. The trail would strengthen briefly, then disappear again. There were moments when the lion stood still for long stretches, his body lowered, his breathing steady but heavy. Watching that hesitation felt almost unbearable because it mirrored the fragile space between hope and disappointment we all recognize. Then came the moment that changed everything. Late one afternoon, as the sun dipped low, the lion caught a scent that stopped him completely. This one was unmistakable. It carried memory with it, layered and clear. His body responded instantly, muscles tightening, head lifting high. He did not circle, he did not pause. He moved forward with sudden urgency. I remember feeling a quiet surge of relief then, as if the journey itself had finally answered him. From that point on, the signs no longer faded as quickly. The land began to align with his direction, offering confirmation instead of confusion. Each step brought subtle familiarity. Each pause reinforced what he already knew deep within him. The lion was close. Not close enough to see or hear or touch, but close enough to believe without question. As darkness fell that night, he did not slow. He moved with purpose, guided by a certainty that no distance could erase. Whatever doubt had followed him for so long finally loosened its grip. Sometimes hope does not arrive as a grand revelation. Sometimes it comes as a quiet signal that tells us we are no longer walking alone. The moment finally arrived without announcement. There was no dramatic sound, no sudden movement to mark it. The lion slowed, his body lowering instinctively as something familiar settled into the air around him. He stopped completely, every sense alert, every breath controlled. Then he saw her. She stood at a distance, smaller than he remembered, her figure framed by a place that did not belong to either of them. For a second, neither moved. Time seemed to stretch thin, holding its breath along with them. The girl was the first to react. She froze, her eyes widening as recognition washed over her. The lion remained still, as if afraid that movement might shatter what stood before him. His tail stilled, his breathing softened. I remember feeling my chest tighten at that pause, because it carried everything they had endured in silence. Slowly, carefully, the lion took a step forward, then another. He did not rush. He did not lower his head or bare his teeth. He moved the way he always had around her, with restraint shaped by trust. The girl did not step back. She stayed where she was, her hands trembling slightly at her sides. When they were close enough to share the same space again, both of them stopped. There was no need for sound. Recognition passed between them in a way words could never hold. The lion's eyes searched her face, as if confirming that this was real, that distance had not changed what mattered. The girl swallowed hard, her breath uneven, her gaze locked onto his. I found myself barely breathing, aware that any interruption would feel like intrusion. She took a small step forward, then another, until she stood within reach. The lion lowered his head slightly, not in submission, but in familiarity. The girl lifted her hand, hesitated, then rested it gently against him. He did not flinch. He leaned into the touch, just enough to close the space that had separated them for so long. In that instant, the journey vanished. The distance, the waiting, the uncertainty, all collapsed into a single moment of return. The world around them continued as it always had, but for those few seconds, nothing else existed. The lion's body relaxed for the first time since he had left. The girl's shoulders softened, tension releasing in a quiet rush. I realized then how rare it is to witness reunion without urgency, without noise, without fear. Just recognition, complete and unguarded. They stayed like that longer than anyone expected. No movement, no sound, just presence. It was as if both were memorizing the moment, anchoring it deep enough to withstand whatever came next. Eventually, voices carried through the space. People noticed. The spell began to thin. The girl stepped back slightly, her eyes never leaving the lion. He lifted his head, alert but calm, as if he understood that this moment could not last forever. Still, something had changed. The journey had not only brought him to her, it had confirmed what distance could not undo. The bond they shared had survived separation, uncertainty, and silence. As they were guided apart once more, the lion did not resist. He watched her, steady and certain, as if knowing that this time the ending was not the same. Sometimes reunion is not about staying together. Sometimes it is about knowing, without doubt, that what was shared was real. After the reunion, the land seemed to breathe again. The tension that had stretched across miles slowly loosened, settling into something quieter, something reflective. The lion remained near the edge of the space, calm but alert, as if carrying the moment with him rather than clinging to it. The girl was guided away gently this time, her steps steadier, her gaze lingering until distance made it impossible to see him clearly. Nothing dramatic followed, no sudden shift, no clear resolution that tied every thread neatly together. Life resumed its movement, just as it always does. Yet something fundamental had changed beneath the surface. The lion did not return immediately to the wild he had left behind. He lingered for a time, resting, observing, as though allowing the journey to settle within him. The urgency that once drove him forward had softened into something deeper. He had found what he was looking for, not in permanence, but in certainty. Watching this final chapter unfold, I found myself thinking about how rarely we acknowledge the courage it takes to let a story end without forcing it to stay. The girl carried the reunion with her as well. Those who noticed her afterward spoke of a quiet change in the way she moved, the way she looked at the world around her. She did not speak often about what had happened. She did not need to. Some experiences do not ask to be explained. They ask only to be remembered. The lion eventually turned back toward the land that shaped him. His steps were slower now, his movements measured, as if the journey had taught him restraint alongside resolve. He disappeared into the familiar horizon, not as a creature who had lost something, but as one who had completed what he set out to do. I realized then that what stayed with me most was not the distance he traveled, but the intention behind every step. This story is not about defying nature. It is about understanding it more deeply. Bonds form not because they are convenient, but because they are felt. Memory does not belong only to humans. Loyalty does not require language. And determination, when guided by connection rather than fear, can carry us farther than we ever expect. Perhaps the most important lesson here is a quiet one. Not everything meaningful is meant to last forever in the way we imagine. Some connections exist to change us, to teach us how deeply we can care, and then to release us back into our own paths. There is something profoundly human in that truth. I find myself returning to the image of the lion walking away after the reunion, his head lifted, his pace steady. It reminds me that love does not always demand possession. Sometimes it simply asks us to show up, to walk the distance, and to honor what was shared. If there is one thing this journey teaches, it is this: compassion does not weaken strength, it refines it. Remembering someone does not trap us in the past. It gives us direction and hope, even when it leads us across uncertainty, and silence is never wasted. Maybe that is the quiet gift this story leaves behind. A reminder that the paths we choose, especially the difficult ones, reveal who we are long after the journey ends.